Here we go. I love this. S hits the fan.
So, Bennett Freeman, what's your first statement?
My first statement is that it is impractical and unreasonable for global apparel brands to exercise human rights due diligence related to Uyghur forced labor in Xinjiang due to political and practical constraints. And therefore, they must sever links to all suppliers with potential links to Uyghur forced labor.
Yeah, but by this logic, any company that faces these political or practical constraints to HRDD, which is everybody, specifically where a government or an industry association does not permit, for example, a local NGO or an auditor to work without harassment or threat, companies therefore should sever links with suppliers from that country or region. I mean, would this extend, the implications of the Uyghur context to countries like Malaysia, Bangladesh, Vietnam?
The Uyghur context is probably uniquely severe in the world today in terms of the degree and scope of forced labor, but also especially in terms of the political constraints that make what we think of as human rights due diligence impractical, if not impossible. There was initially the last maybe 2020 into 2021, some hope and expectation that brands would undertake due diligence, but the problem was absolutely entrenched and on a massive scale, despite the repeated denials of the Chinese government. And at the same time, it became apparent that what the conditions that are necessary for credible, effective due diligence really aren't present, especially in terms of access to workers, to their families, to local communities, the ability to look at forced labor and the broader economic, cultural, and political context in which it takes place. So I've been involved with the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region since it was formed in the winter or spring of 2020. And we basically have taken the position since at least mid-2020 that companies should just exit, sever links to suppliers, at least the first tier suppliers, in reaction to the U.S. Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which was signed into law last December 23rd, 2021. So we are seeing this significant exit of Western apparel companies from suppliers in Xinjiang, even without the benefit of full human rights due diligence. I think the wise companies realized earlier rather than later that on the ground due diligence is really limited, if not impossible.
What about the cost of that decision? A company invests to do the HRDD. They discover their goods are not coming from that area. They've got audits reinforced by direct worker voice. So they can prove they are clean. And if not, they have no choice but to leave. So should countries say to companies operating in their territory that there will be no political obstacle from our side to doing your direct worker voice audit? As the government of Vietnam or Thailand, we assure you that you will not face any issues from us. Come in, do whatever you need to do. You may even get some help from our agencies in an open and transparent manner. Is that likely to happen?
It has happened in some circumstances. I really do think that in countries like Malaysia, which is of course a democracy with a vibrant civil society, although there are some authoritarian elements at work in its politics, as we know well, but nonetheless, it's a relatively open country and economy, and human rights due diligence is certainly not only possible, but is undertaken, even as civil society is under pressure in some ways, including trade unions. So that's a perfect example of a country where it's important for foreign multinationals to be present and to be pressing and work with the government to improve transparency and accountability and workers' rights. Vietnam is a tougher case, of course, because unlike Malaysia, it's not a democracy. But Vietnam, as we know well, has become an increasingly competitive sourcing platform for Western apparel and, for that matter, consumer electronics brands. Particularly as some of that work has come from China. So now there is no freedom of association as the ILO defines it in Vietnam. Trade unions are not independent of the government, but there have been some examples over the years now of trade unions actually organized and representing workers' interests in the workplace, even as they're not fundamentally independent of the government. And that's a trend that has to be supported and accelerated. And I think the Western multinationals working with suppliers based in Vietnam have a tremendous opportunity and responsibility to operate, to press as far as they can, to get that country to open up more in its own interests.
All right, let's move on to your second statement.
The International Olympic Committee, the IOC, was wise not to disclose the identity of the third-party independent auditor it selected to audit a major supplier of Beijing Olympic sportswear sourcing from Xinjiang.
So I know you're being deliberately provocative. So
Yes.
Let me just respond by asking, how can a consumer possibly trust the claims of the IOC if we do not know who the verifying body is? How can that be wise? I mean, surely transparency requires that the process of how the investigation was conducted and by whom, that's all integral to our decision-making as a buying public on whether or not this is a credible finding.
Right. Largely due to the unwillingness, I have to say, of the IOC to engage with us or to be sufficiently transparent. That said, the IOC did commission an independent third-party auditor to do an audit of one of its major suppliers. And I was told by a couple people whose professional and personal judgment I respect entirely, that it was a third-party auditor, independent auditor that I know of, may not know them well personally, but one that I'm aware of. It's a credible one, and that for the safety of their staff and their ability to do other work in China, whether in Xinjiang or elsewhere, that it was very important to keep their identity confidential, and that was a decision that was made by the third-party independent auditor together with the IOC. My reaction was, you're not disclosing much, if anything, about the methodology, and you're not even disclosing the identity of the independent auditor. This exercise therefore has zero credibility. But then thinking about it a little more, as much of as critical as my colleagues and I were of the overall exercise, we did realize that there was an exceptional circumstance here, so we backed off that one element of the criticism. But I just think it's important, as we think about transparency and accountability for labor and human rights, global supply chains, that while we have constant principles and a commitment to transparency, that we also have the flexibility in exceptional circumstances to consider some of these nuances.
I mean, I think flexibility is part and parcel of being reasonable. And if we're all reasonable people around the table, then I think fine. But the question is, if we're presenting a bowl of cherry-picked cherries, we have no idea what the tree looks like, or in fact, where these cherries come from. And maybe, so with that, what is your third proposition?
The third one is one that I really relish. It's a controversial one. It's one that I have direct experience in, going back literally 20 years. So The proposition is very straightforward. Human rights impact assessments, whether focusing on supply chain labor or on broader human rights issues, do not always necessarily need to be disclosed, or at least not fully disclosed.
Okay, so we were just talking about the absurdity that is tied to not being transparent about who actually did the thing. And now we're talking about the idea of not even revealing what may have come out in a full fashion. So maybe we should make a distinction between disclosure and discovery. I mean, I have no problem with a company choosing to selectively disclose whatever it wants in order to present itself in a favorable context. I mean, that's what companies do. They cherry pick in that context, but also it's a bit of spin. Okay, but that should not really stop any information from being made available for discovery by others. I mean, that's just good practice, good research. We all look at things differently, but hiding information is a form of disinformation. It's dishonest, right, and it's wrong.
Completely agree. But again, I wanted to highlight nuances that I think are important to be aware of in exceptional circumstances. And I think that by definition, human rights impact assessments, at least the fact that they've been conducted, need to be disclosed, that companies need to disclose why they've been conducted, who's conducted them, what the methodology, what the scope has been, and really what the main findings have been. I'm absolutely consistent and resolute in that view. That said, just over 20 years ago, we undertook this human rights risk assessment commissioned by BP for their Tangguh LNG operation in West Papua, then and now the focus of a low-intensity conflict that has occasionally been violent. The debate occurred before doing presentations to BP stakeholders in London and then in Washington on the HRIA itself. And the debate was, should the entire document be disclosed, released, published, or should it only be released selectively in the form of a summary and a list of most of the major, not every single one of the major recommendations? The latter decision was taken with my strong support. And this was, I was then and now self-identified first and foremost as a human rights advocate. I had come to this project having just served as U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. But the reason that we made that recommendation and BP decided not to publish the full piece is that there was some content particularly related to Indonesian military and security forces that was so politically sensitive that its disclosure would have been disruptive, if not damaging, to BP's relationships, both with the Indonesian military and with the Indonesian government. There were also specific recommendations made for BP to protect a certain human rights defender at risk, rumors that he was targeted for assassination. And there was a recommendation made to deploy certain diplomatic means discreetly to try to protect him. So given the sensitivity of those issues, the volatility of the situation on the ground, the complexity of the client company's relationships at the time and since, but to a lesser extent, I'm sure, with the Indonesian government, the decision was made to not publish the full HRIA, instead produce a 10 or 12 page summary of the key points and recommendations. And I think, Puvan, that for many years that summary itself was the gold standard for disclosure before, in more recent years, we've seen the publication, the disclosure of full HRIAs. And the reason I stand by this decision, and it was based partly on my recommendation as one of the two outside consultants, but is that I believe firmly and fiercely that human rights risk assessments, impact assessments need to be unsparing, both in their analysis and in their recommendations to the client company. But again, this is an example where I think we have to exercise some discretionary judgment in exceptional circumstances from a human rights perspective.
You were part and parcel of that process of deciding what is reasonable. And in that context, that is absolutely acceptable. I think what is unacceptable is a butchered report that delivers only the prime cuts. So I absolutely agree that a professional human rights, business and human rights consultant brings the nuance and a longer term understanding of consequences for all the stakeholders involved. We need to have the Indonesian government as a partner. We don't want the military to shut down the internet. We don't want the company to just walk away and abandon the community as a total liability. That professionalism is the difference between looking at the sustainability of the outcome as opposed to a single NGO, a single issue NGO banging a drum for a cause, but not understanding the implications of what happens afterward.
Exactly. I think that's exactly the right lesson. And I think that the point here broadly across the three propositions that we've discussed is that there needs to be consistency of purpose, of principle. There needs to be transparency and accountability as the default assumption of how we go about this work in the business and human rights world generally, and specifically in the supply chain labor rights arena. But at the same time, we also have to be observant and respectful of exceptional circumstances where we need to take nuanced approaches. And what is most effective from a human rights perspective? Ultimately, this field depends not just on laws and regulations and standards, but on growing trust, which we're always going to have to work hard at to establish, let alone to maintain. But I just think that it's important, as we're now 2 decades, really a quarter century into the business and human rights world, really a quarter century now since the mid-90s, that we learn from some of these nuances, even as we reinforce our commitment to basic principles.